From Software had called Elden Ring Dark Souls 4, I don't think anyone would be too surprised at what they experienced in the first few hours of their new game. After a weekend with early access to the Elden Ring network test, I've gotten a small taste of what Elden Ring is. And after years of anticipation, I was a little taken aback by just how much Dark Souls DNA is still here. Hey, this is Wes from PC Gamer, and honestly, it feels a little surreal to not be thinking about Elden Ring anymore, but to finally actually be playing it. Compared to my first time playing Dark Souls almost a decade ago, Elden Ring doesn't really make me feel lost or overwhelmed or like I'm at the mercy of a world that is absolutely indifferent to my existence. Elden Ring instead is familiar. It's trying to take From Software's style of RPG to a scale we've never seen before. I spent about 2 full days exploring the part of Elden Ring available in the network test and kept finding new things spread across the open world map. Mini dungeons to explore, cool NPCs and unique enemies, new weapons and weapon arts to change how those weapons work. There's something like a dozen bosses to fight in this small slice of the game alone. So yeah, this is going to be a very big game. After playing as much Elden Ring as I could, I've been thinking a lot about how it fits in with the Dark Souls series, what it does differently, and what I enjoyed most during my time with the network test. There's still so much to learn about the final game, but my first impressions, based on what I have been able to play, aren't completely positive. So for this video, I'm going to go through them one by one, starting with what I did really like. Here are the highlights of a dozen hours playing Elden Ring. If you play the Dark Souls games back to back, and Sekiro, and Bloodborne, it's obvious just how much better From Software has gotten at combat feel and animation with each game. Elden Ring feels like an even more refined Dark Souls 3. Positioning matters, and you're probably going to get in trouble if you're just spamming the attack button, but you are a bit faster and more maneuverable than in the older Souls games. Of course, so are most of the enemies you're fighting. Playing the game in performance mode on a PlayStation 5, I didn't notice any performance drops from 60 FPS. It was really smooth, and I hope that carries over to the PC version. The fundamentals are largely the same as in the Souls games. You have a standard and a heavy attack with different animations. You have to pay careful attention to enemy animations to read their attack patterns and dodge through them at just the right time. You have a stamina meter that'll run out if you swing too many times or block too many heavy hits. There's a ton of depth here to discover in what enemies are weak to, what attacks will stagger them, and so on. Most of that is extremely familiar, but there are some new tools at our disposal too. Let's go through a couple of them. Wow, it is so nice to have a jump button. Thanks Sekiro for making jumping so important that it's now a supported feature in the From Software game engine. In Elden Ring, the open world has all kinds of craggy outcroppings and decrepit structures that just wouldn't work in the older games, but they're now much easier to get around with a real jump. There's no Breath of the Wild style climbing here, but the jump does a lot to make you feel like you're exploring a more natural world. Knee-high walls are no longer an impossible impediment. Jumping has its place in combat, too. Jumping attacks can actually do more poise damage to enemies, so knowing when to mix those in is important. And honestly, they're just kind of fun. Elden Ring is the most flexible Souls game by a long shot. If you play the Souls games anything like I do, you're probably referencing a wiki to determine what the single best weapon is for a dex builder or the best rod for a sorcerer, figuring out how to quickly get your hands on whatever materials it will take to upgrade them. That style of play inevitably means that 95% of the loot you find in any given playthrough is completely useless. Elden Ring feels like it's designed quite deliberately to challenge that playstyle and make character building far, far more flexible. In Dark Souls 3, weapons all had weapon arts attached to them that gave them specific abilities. Elden Ring brings that system back, except the abilities are no longer locked to the individual weapons. You find the ability and attach it to the weapon of your choice. And you'll find these weapon arts as rewards all over the open world map, in chests and inside mini dungeons. Now, here's the big thing. These weapon abilities, called Ashes of War, can also imbue weapons with affinities, which means you can basically make any weapon in the game a magic weapon, or change which stats it scales with. This system, along with some changes to character stats, makes me think that From Software wants players to come up with unique builds, and crucially, use both magic and melee together instead of sticking to just one constant playstyle. I played a couple hours of co-op with another journalist, and we were impressed by how smoothly summoning worked in Elden Ring, despite the size of the world and how much freedom it gives you. There's a password system if you want to only play with friends, and using that we're able to see each other's summon signs just like in any previous Souls game. When we summoned in the open world, we didn't run into any restrictions on how far apart we could roam, though you're not allowed to ride your spectral steed while in co-op. There was one disappointing limitation. When you find a dungeon to enter from the overworld, it's seamless in single player, but it throws up a fog wall in multiplayer, preventing you from entering in co-op. Your friend has to leave your world, and then you can walk into the dungeon and resummon them once they have walked or fast traveled to it in their own world. I wish that barrier wasn't there, but I understand why it is. They treat the dungeons as separate summon areas, and with fast travel from anywhere on the map, it's still really easy to pick up with just a short delay. Multiplayer in this game is clearly going to be a major initiative. It actually has its own dedicated entry on the main menu now. It doesn't take long for you to gain access to Elden Ring's Spectral Steed, which you can summon from the Ether on command. I was pleasantly surprised by how easy and fun the steed is to control. It's snappy and video gamey in a way that movement usually isn't in the Dark Souls games, and it's a very different feel than the more realistic horses in something like Red Dead Redemption 2. The Spectral Steed almost feels less like a horse, more like a fantastical beast, like Prince Ashitaka's Red Elk in Studio Ghibli's Princess Mononoke. My favorite thing about the Spectral Steed is that it actually has a double jump. I took real pleasure in using it to quickly jump up the sides of boulders and fallen structures I couldn't climb up on foot. It's easily the best thing about Elden Ring's new open world. Within the first hour or so of playing Elden Ring, I came across this little grove of trees where a voice started talking to me, complaining that no one would make eye contact with it. Eventually, I took a swing and figured out that the voice was coming from a bush, which then turned into a demi-human monkey man once I hit it. It was a really fun and memorable discovery, and like nothing else I had encountered in the game. There's a lot of loot to find out in Elden Ring's world, but this is the one thing that really makes me hopeful that the map is full of unique bits of storytelling too. Okay, now for the negatives. Elden Ring's open world is absolutely going to be its most controversial design choice, and from what I played in the network test, I think it dilutes what makes the Souls games special, their intricate, interconnected level design. I spent hours exploring just a small portion of Elden Ring's map, and I think that the openness does have some real benefits. It meshes well with the more flexible RPG character building that I mentioned earlier. It's genuinely really cool to play a huge game like this and know exactly where you should go on the map to grab a particular weapon or ability or armor set right from the outset. I think speedrunners are going to love the freedom here. But so far, from what I've seen, that flexibility has come at the expense of the world being made up of one dense area after another. There's a lot of open ground that you'll just quickly ride past. There are a lot of crafting ingredients scattered around that just kind of feel like they're there because that's what you put in open world games, and the environment would be too barren if you didn't have them. Elden Ring isn't really anything like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild or RPGs like Skyrim, though I'm sure it will conjure up endless comparisons to the two. Unless there are some major aspects of the game being kept secret in this opening area, there are no real puzzles to solve, there are no NPCs to take explicit quests from. You can kill enemies and find loot, but there's very little else to do in terms of interacting with all that empty space. From Software has said Elden Ring is full of legacy dungeons, which are larger spaces that reflect the classic Souls level design. I got to explore part of one of them, Stormvale Castle, in the network test. Only parts of it were accessible, so it's hard to say how it stacks up against other Dark Souls castles. But it didn't really convince me that legacy dungeons will make up for so much of the game taking place in the open world, unless there are a lot of them. And aside from the legacy dungeons, the other smaller spaces I found to explore were pretty disappointing. As you explore the open world, you'll find caves, staircases that lead underground, doors built into cliff faces that all lead to mini dungeons. Each one of these that I explored was unfortunately pretty uninteresting. Most of them were basically just a corridor or two with a few enemies, then a boss chamber and a reward, which is probably going to be a weapon ash. Now, going back to the overworld structure, I do, again, think it's really cool how open-ended Elden Ring is. Being able to beeline for one of these dungeons once you've discovered it will be a great New Game Plus experience. I think it'll also be wonderful for multiplayer, where you can hop into a co-op session and show a friend or a stranger where to find a particular cave with the perfect sword for their build. I just wish I didn't feel like From Software had sliced up its usual dense worlds into 100 tiny standalone hallways which are not interesting or challenging to navigate. Their simplicity saps away a lot of the mystery and the tension of exploration. That said, I think there is some hope here. I was only able to explore the beginning area of the map, and there was one dungeon that was a bit more complex than the other ones and had some distinct personality, including a troll with a cave full of hoarded gold. If the full game has many more of those kind of dungeons that have a little bit more meat on them, it may not end up as disappointing as I'm worried about. Controlling the spectral steed is surprisingly fun, but I don't think the same goes for fighting on horseback. It's very simple. You basically just do a single chopping motion off to your side, so most mounted combat comes down to riding circles around enemies and awkwardly swinging at them. If you use the lock-on camera, it can be a bit nauseating, but then if you don't use the lock-on camera, you're liable to whiff on half your swings and end up hitting empty air. It's actually kind of funny. I don't hate it, but compared to all the nuance in regular combat, mounted combat kind of feels more like a medieval times farce. One thing that is extremely cool, though, is leaping off your mount straight into a jump attack. That's the good stuff. Finally, Elden Ring feels like Dark Souls 4 in all but name. When Elden Ring was announced, it felt like a sea change moment for From Software. After the incredible success of their last few games, they were making something new, with an open world and writing from George R.R. Martin, and 5 years at this point of development time. With all of that as the lead up to Elden Ring, I think it's striking just how much this feels like Dark Souls 4, right down to basic stylistic touches and assets even pulled straight from previous games. Like, look at this rat. That is a very, very familiar rat. Mechanically, so much of this game is just Dark Souls. The stat pages in the menus, the inventory, the sound effects for counters and backstabs, the text on screen that says you died, it's all there, barely changed. And look, I like all of these things in Dark Souls, but come on, even the description of your character in Elden Ring, the Tarnished, is like a thesaurus.com synonym for hollow or ashen one, despite the supposed George R.R. Martin influence. It'll have been almost 6 years since Dark Souls 3 came out when Elden Ring arrives, so maybe another game that feels very, very similar is exactly what most people want from Elden Ring at this point. But then there's Elden Ring's open world, which seems like it may be largely replacing the level design Souls fans love so much. That might have been an easier design change to accept if the rest of Elden Ring didn't otherwise feel so similar to Dark Souls. And I can't stress enough that I love the Souls series. I'll still be replaying those games a decade from now. And maybe beyond the first few hours of Elden Ring, there's some amazing legacy dungeons and other things that give it a more defined personality. I just keep thinking about Sekiro, and how brilliantly it pulled some elements from the Souls games while feeling completely different in its combat. I expected a bit more of that creativity from Elden Ring, and I hope I find it deeper in the game beyond what I saw in the opening hours. The public network test for Elden Ring runs from November 12th to 15th, but it's only available on consoles. If you want to play on PC, you don't have too long to wait. The full game is out February 25th, 2022.